You were not sentenced for a crime. You were sent away for being inconvenient. A mouth that talked back, a pregnancy no man would claim, a secret too dangerous to die with you. Behind the cold stone walls of medieval women's prisons, justice was not the goal, compliance was, and the methods used to extract it were worse than execution. Hidden in monasteries, castles, and underground cells, these prisons erased women without a trace. But the walls remember, the iron still bears scratch marks, and what happened inside was never spoken of again until now. The door was never slammed, it was closed, slowly, carefully, like the ceiling of a tomb. No shouting, no final goodbye. Only the dull scrape of wood against stone, followed by the unmistakable sound of a lock turning for the last time. This was how many women entered medieval prisons. There was no trial, no defense, no name on any record, just silence. Some were widows accused of witchcraft. Others were noble women who had angered their husbands. Some had fallen pregnant outside of marriage. Some had only been born at the wrong time, to the wrong father, with no dowry to buy their freedom. Whatever the reason, once inside, they were treated not as criminals, but as shame itself made flesh something to be hidden, punished, and eventually forgotten. The air was thick, not just with rot, but with the weight of voicelessness. Guards rarely spoke to the prisoners, and when they did, it was only in commands. No questions, no explanations. You slept on straw soaked with the memory of those before you. You ate food that smelled like it had already been digested. Days bled into nights until there was no difference, and the women who tried to keep track, scratching lines into the stone, either broke or were moved. There was a method to the madness, a system designed not to kill, but to dissolve identity piece by piece. The worst part wasn't always the physical suffering. It was the uncertainty. Some women were locked in cages the size of a cupboard, while others were left in open cells but forbidden to speak, to sing, to weep. One woman, recorded only as Elena of the East, was punished for humming a lullaby. They took her tongue, not because it was a threat, but because it had remembered beauty. Other prisons were not even called prisons. They were cloisters, castles, convents, places where silence was framed as virtue and obedience as salvation. But make no mistake, behind the polished stone of abbey walls, behind the iron gates of noble towers, there were dungeons, there were chains, and there were women who never saw sunlight again. Some scratched prayers into the wood, others clawed holes through their own flesh just to feel real. And somewhere deep in that darkness, the walls began to hum with the stories no one was allowed to tell. Stories of women who entered not as witches or heretics or whores, but as daughters, as lovers, as people. Stories we are only just beginning to hear. There were no windows in most cells, but the women learned quickly that they were never alone. The walls watched, the stones seemed to breathe. And in some prisons, you could swear you heard someone whispering your name even when no one had spoken it in weeks. Surveillance in medieval women's prisons didn't come with keys jangling down corridors or guards pacing in boots. It came through the holes in the stone, the slits carved into wooden doors, the silent figures stationed in shadowed alcoves, some guards, some not. There were women, too, assigned to listen. Not for escape plans, but for emotion. A sob at the wrong hour, a muttered curse, a name spoken aloud. These could trigger punishment swift enough to make you forget how it felt to hope. Some cells were connected by tiny vents, accidental or deliberate. No one knew. But words traveled, and so did betrayal. A whispered prayer might reach another prisoner. A secret confession might reach a priest, or worse, a magistrate with no face. The guards rarely needed evidence. All they required was the sound of dissent, and the walls always provided. One prisoner, known only as Agnes, had made the mistake of recalling her sister's name in the dark. Days later, a guard entered, holding a pale piece of paper with a sketch of a flower drawn on it, something her sister once embroidered. Agnes was dragged into a hall and lashed not for escape, but for memory. The message was clear: even your mind is not yours here. Certain cells had markings no one could explain, scratched shapes near floor level, tally marks too high for any woman to reach. Soot blackened in patterns as if torches had been placed deliberately to watch without casting light. In some places, voices echoed without source. You could hear breathing behind walls that weren't hollow. One chronicler described a cell in northern France where the women refused to speak entirely, not out of obedience, but because they believed the walls would repeat their words to the jailer before dawn. Some prisoners began testing this. They would whisper nonsense to the bricks, lies or fantasies, just to see what punishment would come, and it always came. Not in the form of beatings or starvation, but in psychological dismemberment, a prized item missing, a shift in routine, a name removed from the prayer list. The walls had eyes, but worse, they had memory, and the more they absorbed, the more they seemed to decide what you said, what you felt, what you dreamed. In time, some women stopped thinking altogether, afraid their thoughts would be overheard. They let their minds go blank, mouths stay shut, hearts go still. The silence that followed wasn't peace, it was surrender, and the walls were listening. They were not built for justice, they were built for demonstration. Laid out on oaken tables and cold iron racks were the tools of a different kind of power, the kind that wanted to correct by disfigurement, to purify by mutilation. Unlike the universal implements of war or crime, these instruments were tailored, sculpted with a cruel intimacy to the female body. Their names alone whispered intent: the pear of anguish, the breast ripper, the scold's bridle. But behind their theatrical designs lay a philosophy that silence could be manufactured through fear and obedience shaped with steel. The scold's bridle, for instance, was not meant to kill, it was meant to humiliate. A metal cage, locked over the head with a tongue plate pressed cruelly inside the mouth. Women accused of speaking out against husbands, against clergy, or simply too much in public were marched through streets with their faces encased, drooling and gagging while crowds jeered. The punishment wasn't just isolation, it was exposure, ensuring everyone knew that this woman had dared to speak. The breast ripper, on the other hand, made no pretense of survival. Heated until red and applied to the chest, it tore flesh in the name of chastity. Used on women accused of adultery or seduction, it carried no trial, no appeal, only a decision made behind closed doors, and a sentence executed in full view of God. What made these devices especially insidious was how often they were used not after a conviction, but as a method of coercion. Confess, and perhaps it would stop. Resist, and the next instrument would be worse. There were also chastity gags, metal bits shaped to keep the mouth locked shut and the teeth pried apart. Some had spikes, others were lined with sharp ridges to tear the tongue if the prisoner moved. Many were used during religious examinations, when women accused of heresy or demonic possession were forced to undergo days of interrogation without food, water, or speech. But not all devices left visible scars. Some were made to manipulate posture, spiked collars that dug into the neck if the woman bowed, or iron corsets that forced the spine to curve unnaturally. Women wore them for days, sometimes weeks, as punishment for poor posture, disobedient glances, or failing to show proper deference to authority. To walk, to sit, even to sleep became acts of agony. In many prisons, these instruments were proudly displayed, not hidden, but showcased in central halls. They served not just as punishment tools, but as warnings. Women passing by would see what awaited them if they disobeyed, if they questioned, if they dared to resist the role assigned to them. In this way, torture wasn't just physical, it was architectural, it was ambient, it was waiting. Not in the corner of a dungeon, but at the center of a system that believed silence could be engineered, and pain was the quickest path to virtue. There was always one, a space spoken of only in lowered voices, if at all. It did not appear on any official map. No guard ever admitted to unlocking it. No priest ever mentioned it in confession, but every woman who had spent enough nights in a medieval prison knew it existed. They called it many things: the hollow, the black chamber, the door that shouldn't open, but most simply referred to it as the room with no name. It was not where executions happened. It was where something stranger did. The women taken there often returned, changed, if they returned at all. Some emerged hours later with eyes that no longer blinked. Others crawled back, their voices gone, unable to explain what had been done to them. And then there were those who simply vanished. No announcement, no burial, just gone, as if erased from history by the room itself. This space was reserved for women who did not break under standard punishment, those who resisted shame, those who questioned scripture, those who, in the eyes of their jailers, still had too much of themselves left. The accusations were often vague seduction, defiance, sorcery crimes that required no evidence, only discomfort. One such woman, a merchant's wife named Isolde, was rumored to have taught another prisoner how to read a psalm. That was enough. She was taken one evening and never seen again. Her cell remained untouched, her name scratched from the chapel wall. Other women told of strange sounds leaking from the room, not screams, but humming, soft, rhythmic, almost like a lullaby. Some said it wasn't one room but many a series of hidden cells connected by tunnels, designed for secret interrogations and unholy experiments. Inquisitors and noblemen with particular tastes could pay to use them, out of view from public scrutiny. It is said that one nun once glimpsed the chamber and fainted at the sight of the walls carved from stone. Yes, but covered in hundreds of names etched so faintly you could only see them in candlelight. Names of women who had never been recorded in any ledger. Names that shouldn't have been known at all. Those who entered the room with no name often reappeared with new stories, not of what they endured, but of what they were made to do. One prisoner spoke of being forced to punish another woman while watched by unseen figures. Another wept when she confessed she had been offered her freedom if she betrayed a friend. It was not just a room for torture, it was a room for transformation, where cruelty became ritual and the line between victim and executioner blurred beyond recognition. And when the door finally closed, it never echoed. That silence was deeper than pain. It was the sound of something sacred being broken, and the walls never spoke of it again. There were no blades in this punishment, no ropes, no whips, no fire, just food, or rather, the absence of it. In medieval women's prisons, pain did not always need to scream. Sometimes, it whispered through the hollowness of a belly, the dryness of a throat, the slow unraveling of sanity as the body turned against itself. Starvation was not seen as violence, it was framed as penance. You would fast, they said, until your soul was clean. Some women were locked in cells where food was never promised and water was never guaranteed. Meals, if they came, were more ritual than nourishment. A bowl of water mixed with soot, a crust of bread so old it cracked teeth. And then there was the salt. At first, it seemed like mercy, a plate of preserved meat, a soft cheese, salted fish. But the trick was crueler than it appeared. The salt dried the mouth, burned the lips, made the throat feel carved from stone, and no water followed. Days would pass with the prisoners sweating through their sleep, tongues swollen, eyes sunken. They were not meant to die, only to beg. The salt cure, as it came to be called, was favored by certain abbots and wardens who claimed it left no marks, but it did, on the kidneys, the skin, the mind. Women began hallucinating shadows that didn't exist, hearing water drip where there was none. One prisoner, a former midwife named Sabine, wrote with her fingernails into the wall, "My bones are thirsty." She died curled beside that message. Then came the water cure, a method of forced consumption rather than denial. Prisoners were restrained, sometimes upside down, and made to drink until their bodies swelled with it. Their stomachs distended, their lungs seized, their mouths foamed. It was not quick, it was not clean, and it left women gasping not just for air, but for understanding. Many didn't even know what they had been accused of. The crime, if there was one, was often just refusal. Refusing to confess, refusing to kneel, refusing to let go of a name, or a secret, or a sliver of dignity. So they were punished with elements that couldn't be escaped. Hunger, thirst, salt. Their jailers could deny it was torture. There was no wound, no fire, no scream, but the women who survived it came back changed. Slower to speak, slower to dream. Some wept at the sight of a full plate for the rest of their lives. Others forgot their own names but remembered the count of licks it took to dissolve a pebble of salt in their mouths. In these prisons, silence was not just the absence of sound, it was the sound of a body folding in on itself. trying to survive what the mind could not name. Hunger did not need a knife, thirst did not need a flame. The body, left long enough without mercy, would destroy itself on command. And in that destruction, obedience was born. They were not chained in iron, but in silence. Behind the thick stone walls of certain convents, the line between sanctuary and prison blurred until it vanished completely. For many women labeled as morally dangerous widows who spoke too freely, girls who bore children out of wedlock, wives accused of disobedience, the punishment was not a public whipping or a dungeon cell. It was to be hidden among holy women, sent to a convent, but not as a sister. As a prisoner, there, behind the chapel doors, a second justice system thrived, one not governed by kings, but by vows. Nuns became the wardens. Their rosaries clinked like keys. Their scripture was spoken softly, but it framed every act of discipline. They did not see cruelty in what they did. They saw salvation. A woman once free to speak, to weep, to rage, was now watched day and night, her thoughts corrected through prayer, her movements recorded in silence. One wrong glance, and she might be made to sleep on cold stone without blanket or bread. Confessions were required daily, not just of sin, but of thought. Did you dream of your past? Did you desire the outside world? Did your body stir against God's plan? These were the questions whispered through confession grills, and woe to the woman who answered dishonestly or not at all. Some convents had isolation cells, small and windowless, used not for reflection but for erasure. A woman might spend days or weeks locked within, reciting psalms until her voice cracked or her faith broke. If she emerged changed, she was called healed. If she emerged shattered, they said the devil had finally left her. The punishments were designed not for speed, but for permanence. Penitential clothing, coarse wool robes laced with thorns, silence vows imposed not on the nuns, but on the captives, enforced by slaps or days of breadless penance. Some were made to write scripture until their fingers bled, copying verses about female obedience again and again, as though ink could erase identity. What made it more unbearable was the sameness. No male guard to curse, no executioner to fear. Only women dressed in white and black who believed they were saving you by breaking you, and they did it with calm precision, without hatred. That made it worse. One former noblewoman, exiled to a convent after refusing a political marriage, described the experience as being buried in God's house. She survived, but only by pretending to forget who she had been. The convent praised her transformation, but in the dark, she mouthed her real name like a prayer. These places were not prisons in the eyes of the church, they were mercy. Yet for the women inside, they were tombs built from scripture, guarded by sisters who had long forgotten how to question what they were told. And within those cloisters, the cruelest wounds were often inflicted with a kiss on the forehead and a whisper of salvation. They called it evidence, proof of sin. A swollen belly behind prison bars was not met with compassion but with suspicion. In medieval women's prisons, to be pregnant was to carry not just life, but guilt. It did not matter how the child came to be, through assault, through love, or through marriage long forgotten. Once inside those walls, the womb became a site of accusation. Every movement, every moan, was watched for signs not of labor, but of moral failure. Some women were chained through the 9th month, ankles rubbed raw, backs bent under the weight of iron and life. They were not given softer straw. They were not excused from kneeling on stone for prayers. If they cried out in pain, they were told to remember Eve. If they begged for water, they were reminded that suffering purified. The birth itself was rarely attended. In some prisons, midwives were denied access. A guard might stand outside the cell, counting contractions like crimes. One record from a northern cloister describes a woman delivering her child alone, in darkness, shackled to a wall. Her cries, it notes, were excessive, and she was punished the following day for disrupting the silence of prayer. That child did not survive, but the prison kept no record of its name. Other women gave birth only to be accused of infanticide. If the baby was weak, malformed, or stillborn, as so many were under such conditions, it was said to be a sign of witchcraft or impurity. One prisoner was forced to carry the corpse of her child for 3 days before being allowed to bury it. She was told this was penance, that she must feel the weight of her choices. She was 17 years old. There was no male equivalent, no man imprisoned for his body's betrayal, no man tortured for what it could create. For women, their biology became their sentence. To bleed was to be unclean, to conceive was to be corrupt, and to give birth behind bars was to offer up your child to a world that had already condemned you. Some infants were taken, placed with nuns, or vanished entirely. Others were left with their mothers, only to suffer beside them. In one known case, a child lived for 4 months in a cell with no light, its mother surviving on half rations while trying to keep it warm with her own body. When it died, she was blamed for negligence, and punished again. The body of a woman in prison was not just a vessel, it was a battleground. Pain came not only from outside, but from within. Her body betrayed her, grew round, bled, screamed, fed, and every act of it was held against her. In a system that prized silence, the sound of a crying infant was the greatest threat of all, a voice that had not yet learned shame, a future not yet controlled. And so the womb, sacred in one breath, became a crime scene in the next, sealed in chains, judged without trial, and remembered only by the ghosts it carried. The women are gone, but the walls remember. In the ruins of forgotten prisons and shadowed convents, silence still clings to stone like damp. Iron cuffs lie rusted beneath collapsed beams, some still looped in circles small enough for a child's wrist. On a few, if the light catches right, you can still see scratches, rows and rows. Not words, just tally marks, not counting days, but something else. Something they needed to name, even if they couldn't speak it. On one chapel wall, hidden behind plaster peeled back by time, was found a single word, carved with what looked like a bone. Listen, no context, no explanation. Just a final plea that someone, someday, might hear. Beneath these prisons are graves without headstones, bodies stacked without record, women whose names were erased from ledgers, whose stories were never told at trial. They were the inconvenient, the loud, the disobedient, the ones who didn't die in childbirth but survived long enough to be punished for it. Some were simply lost, trapped in institutions that never planned to release them. Their families stopped asking, their churches stopped caring, and when they passed, it was as if they had never lived, but echoes of their suffering outlived them. You can see it in the nunneries that became holding pens for unmarried girls in the centuries that followed. In the workhouses where moral reform meant forced labor, starvation, and silence. In the early asylums, where female patients were restrained not for violence, but for speaking too much, too often, or too clearly. The tools changed shape, but not purpose. The cell became a ward, the chain became a sedative, the accusation became diagnosis. And yet, in every version, the same cold truth remained. When women refused to be quiet, they were locked away. And when they refused to be broken, new methods were invented to do just that. The legacy of medieval women's prisons is not just in what happened, but in how it never truly stopped. We buried the devices, we paved over the graves, but the ideas lived on, disguised as care, cloaked in reform, and the silence remained. In one excavated cell in France, archaeologists found a single shoe the size of a child's with the strap still buckled. They never found a body. Just a shoe, curled slightly, as if its owner had simply vanished. What was left behind was never just the object. It was the absence, the deliberate forgetting, the hope that history, too, might be silenced. But it wasn't, not completely. Some stories pressed too deep to disappear, some fingernails scraped too far. And now, centuries later, those scratches speak louder than ever. Listen close. The walls are still talking. If this story unsettled you, it was meant to, because these aren't just whispers from the past, they are warnings carved in stone. If you want to hear the truths that history tried to bury, subscribe to Forgotten Stories Ancient World. Like this video, turn on notifications, and stay with us, because the next door we open might be one they never meant for anyone to find again.